All right, today we are diving into one of the most intense and honestly game-changing stories in the entire book of Exodus. It's a story packed with betrayal, some serious divine fury, and a pretty desperate attempt to put a shattered relationship back together. We're talking about the crisis of the golden calf and its really surprising solution, the Tabernacle. So let's get into how this all went down.
But you know what? Before we jump in, let's start with a little mystery. If you've ever seen Michelangelo's incredible statue of Moses, you might have noticed something a little weird. He's got horns, like actual horns growing out of his head. Why? It looks so strange, almost demonic, right? Well, stick with me, because the answer is actually buried right inside the story we're about to explore, and I promise we'll have it all figured out by the end. So let's set the scene. Moses is way up on Mount Sinai, getting the law straight from God. But down at the base of the mountain, the people he literally just saved from slavery in Egypt, they're getting antsy. And in this massive moment of fear and, frankly, amnesia, they commit what the Bible calls a great apostasy. It's a complete betrayal of the covenant they just made by building and worshiping a golden calf.
Now, God's reaction here is staggering. This is not just mild disappointment. The text says God's anger is burning hot. So hot, in fact, that his plan is to just wipe the Israelites off the map and start the whole chosen people thing over again, fresh with Moses. I mean, the covenant is hanging by a thread.
And this is where Moses' role takes this fascinating turn. He's not just their leader anymore. In this moment, he becomes their defender. He literally stands in the gap between a furious God and a people who are seconds away from being destroyed, and he starts pleading for them. And here's the crazy part. It works. Because Moses makes these powerful arguments, the text uses a very specific Hebrew word, naham. It means to relent, to change one's mind. The scripture says God relented from the disaster he was planning. It's this incredible moment that shows us a core idea in the Bible, that real heartfelt prayer and intercession can actually change things.
But Moses isn't done. He goes back up the mountain, and he makes this absolutely mind-blowing offer. He basically says, look, if you won't forgive their sin, then just erase me from your book of life. Let me take the hit. He is offering up his own salvation for his people. It's a level of commitment that just echoes throughout the rest of the story of the Bible.
So after successfully pleading for everyone's lives, Moses comes down from the mountain. And the whole vibe changes instantly. The spiritual battle up on the mountain might be over, but as Moses walks into the camp, the physical confrontation is just getting started.
What we see here is this wild contrast in Moses' roles. Up on the mountain, he's the intercessor, their lawyer, begging for mercy. But down in the camp, seeing the chaos with his own eyes, he becomes the enforcer, the one who has to execute judgment to clean up the mess. It's two totally different sides of the same leader in the very same crisis.
So when Moses sees the calf and this out-of-control party, he takes the stone tablets, the ones written by God's own finger, and he shatters them. Now, this isn't just a temper tantrum. It's a deeply symbolic act. Those tablets were the covenant, and by smashing them, Moses was showing the people in the most dramatic way possible exactly what they had just done. They broke it.
Then Moses confronts his own brother Aaron, the guy who let this whole disaster happen. And Aaron gives one of the most famous and frankly pathetic excuses in history. He basically says, well, they gave me their gold, I tossed it in the fire, and poof, out came this calf. He completely dodges any responsibility, even though the text says he was the one who fashioned it with a tool.
The consequences that follow are severe. Moses stands at the camp entrance and yells, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And his own tribe, the Levites, they rally to his side. Then, at God's command, they go through the camp, and by the time it's over, about 3,000 of the main instigators are dead. It's a brutal but decisive end to the rebellion.
But here's this incredible twist. That violent act of loyalty completely changes the destiny of the tribe of Levi. See, they had this ancestral curse hanging over them because of their violent past, a curse that said they'd be scattered. But on this day, by standing for God, even against their own relatives, they turn that curse into a blessing. They get set apart for the sacred service of the sanctuary.
Okay, so the rebellion has been put down, but the relationship is still in pieces. The tablets are shattered, thousands of people are dead. How do you possibly fix this? How can God live among a people who have proven themselves so untrustworthy?
Well, Moses gets new stone tablets and the covenant is renewed, but a brand new problem pops up.
God says, I'll send an angel ahead of you, but I'm not going with you myself because you are a stiff-necked people and I might just destroy you along the way. So they're saved, but they've lost the one thing that made them who they were, the actual, tangible presence of God among them.
The solution, which comes after even more prayer from Moses, is the tabernacle. It's described as a kind of movable Sinai. It's God's own divinely designed plan for his holy presence to live safely right in the middle of his people. You can't miss the contrast here. The golden calf was humanity's failed man-made attempt to control God's presence, and the tabernacle is God's own gracious gift to provide it.
And this brings us right back around to our mystery from the beginning. After all this, when Moses comes down the mountain from talking with God, the text says his face had changed. The original Hebrew verb is karan, which means to send out rays or to be radiant. But a related noun, karen, means horn, and since ancient Hebrew didn't have written vowels, it was a little ambiguous.
So what happened? Well, when St. Jerome was translating the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, a version called the Vulgate, he translated karan as cornuta, which means horned. Centuries later, Michelangelo, who read the Latin Vulgate, faithfully sculpted what the text said. So those famous horns on Moses, they're the amazing result of a fascinating translation choice, frozen forever in marble.
But what's the lasting importance of the tabernacle? Why does it matter so much? Well, to get it, we need two quick ideas: symbol and type. A symbol represents a spiritual truth right now, in the present. The tabernacle symbolized God living with his people right then. But a type uses that symbol to point forward to an even bigger future fulfillment of that same truth.
And this is where the whole story just opens up. The tabernacle, that symbol of God's presence, becomes a type. It's just the first step in this incredible story that unfolds through history. First, you have the tabernacle. Then, centuries later, the Gospel of John says Jesus came and tabernacled among us. Then, the church itself is called the house of God, and it all points to this ultimate future, a new Jerusalem, where God will finally live with his people forever.
So, what started as a catastrophic crisis in the desert becomes the blueprint for the entire story of redemption. It's not just about a tent. It's about God's relentless desire to live with his people, a desire that moves from a portable building to a person to a people, and finally to a permanent, perfect home. And that leaves us with one final thought. How does seeing the tabernacle is just the beginning of a story, not the end, change how we think about sacred space today?